the investigators, they all said the exact same thing. And for a decade and a half, I believed them. I buried an empty casket, and I mourned a boy who I thought was resting at the bottom of the sea. But at 3 a.m. today, my phone rang. A voice I had not heard in 15 agonizing years whispered through the heavy static. "Dad, it is Tyler. I am at the harbor. Please help me." I froze every muscle in my body, locking up. But when I finally got there, what I found set off a chain of events that would shatter my entire reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that a father's instinct is never wrong and that the truth will always rise to the surface no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. My name is Richard Callahan. I am 70 years old, and I have spent my entire life building a shipping and logistics empire right here in Seattle. I am a man of facts, of schedules, of coordinates, and calculated risks. I do not believe in ghosts. I do not believe in miracles. But at exactly 3 o'clock this morning, the absolute silence of my mansion was torn apart by the sharp, relentless ringing of my cell phone. I was lying awake in the dark, listening to the heavy Seattle rain beat against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bedroom. The house was dead quiet. My wife Monica was sound asleep beside me, her breathing steady and calm. I reached over to the nightstand, my joints aching slightly with the damp cold, and picked up the phone. The screen glared brightly in the pitch-black room. The caller ID simply read, "Unknown." At my age and in my line of work, a phone call at 3 a.m. never brings good news. It usually means a cargo ship has been delayed, a container has been compromised, or a storm has derailed a multi-million-dollar supply chain. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice low so I would not wake Monica. For a moment, there was nothing but the harsh, crackling sound of digital static and the distant howling wind. I was about to hang up, assuming it was a misdial or a bad connection from one of my overseas port managers. But then a voice broke through the noise. It was faint, ragged, and trembling with a kind of raw terror that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. "Dad." I stopped breathing. The air was instantly sucked right out of my lungs. My hand tightened around the phone so hard the casing groaned. "Dad, please, it is Tyler." My mind violently rejected what my ears were hearing. Tyler was gone. My eldest son, my boy from my first marriage, had died 15 years ago. I remembered the exact day the Coast Guard commander called me. I remembered the sickening drop in my stomach when he explained that the yacht Tyler had been vacationing on had suffered a catastrophic engine fire. It had burned to the waterline before sinking into the dark, freezing depths of the Atlantic. They found debris. They found life jackets. But they never found Tyler. For 15 years, I have carried the crushing weight of that empty mahogany casket. I have lived with the agonizing reality that my son was reduced to ash and ocean water. But the voice on the other end of the line was his. It was older, rougher, choked with a desperation I had never heard before. But the cadence, the slight hesitation before he said the word, "Dad," it belonged to my son. Tyler. I whispered, my voice completely abandoning me. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped animal. "Tyler, where are you?" "I am at Pier 4. The voice gasped, barely audible over the sound of heavy machinery in the background. "Please help me. They are coming back. You have to hurry." Before I could ask who was coming back, before I could demand to know how this was even possible, I heard something else through the speaker. A deep, guttural shout in a language I did not speak, something Eastern European, rough and angry. Then came the unmistakable sound of a heavy metal door slamming shut, and the line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen as it went black. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. A logical man would have called the police. A rational 70-year-old billionaire would have assumed it was a cruel prank, an extortion scheme cooked up by someone who knew my tragic family history. But I was not a rational man in that moment. I was a father who had just heard his dead son begging for his life. I did not wake Monica. I did not wake my youngest son, Derek, who lives just across the hall. I moved with a sudden frantic energy I did not know I still possessed. I threw on a heavy wool coat over my sleepwear, grabbed my truck keys from the valet tray, and practically ran down the sweeping staircase of my home. The rain was coming down in sheets as I threw open the front doors and rushed out into the freezing Seattle night. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and tore out of the driveway, my tires slipping on the wet asphalt. My mind was a chaotic blur of grief, confusion, and blind panic. Pier 4 was one of the oldest and most isolated industrial docks in the city. It was a place dominated by towering, rusted cranes and endless rows of shipping containers. It was not a place someone went for a casual stroll at 3 in the morning. As I sped through the desolate, rain-slicked streets, the memories I had spent 15 years trying to suppress came flooding back with agonizing clarity. I remembered Tyler's laugh. I remembered the day he graduated from college, standing tall and proud, ready to take on the world. And I remembered the absolute void that consumed my life when they told me he was dead. I threw myself into my work after that. I built my company into an unstoppable machine, using success as a shield to block out the pain. I married Monica, hoping to rebuild a fractured family, and focused on raising Derek. I did everything I could to move forward. But hearing that voice tonight had ripped open a scar that had never truly healed. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, running a red light, as the harbor finally came into view. The sprawling expanse of Pier 4 looked like a ghost town under the sickly yellow glow of the sodium streetlights. Massive cargo ships bobbed heavily in the dark water, their massive steel hulls groaning against the docks. The rain was relentless, washing over the windshield in heavy waves as I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a halt near the edge of the pier. I shoved the door open and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The wind whipped off the Puget Sound, biting through my coat. "Tyler," I shouted, my voice swallowed instantly by the sheer vastness of the industrial port. "Tyler, are you here?" There was no answer. Only the rhythmic clanking of chains hitting the metal masts of the ships and the low mechanical hum of a distant generator. I started walking, the cold rain soaking my hair and running down my face. I moved past towering stacks of rusted shipping containers, my eyes scanning the deep black shadows stretching between them. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound felt like a footstep. I walked deeper into the labyrinth of steel and wet concrete, my heart pounding so hard my chest physically ached. I called out his name again and again, but the harbor remained stubbornly, terrifyingly empty. There was no sign of my son. There was no sign of anyone. The rational part of my brain began to creep back in, whispering that I was an old fool chasing ghosts in the rain. I was standing in the freezing dark, screaming for a dead man. I stopped near a pile of wooden pallets, breathless and shivering, ready to admit defeat. Ready to believe that my mind had finally snapped under the weight of 15 years of unresolved grief. But then, from the narrow, pitch-black alley between two massive red containers, I heard a sound. It was the faint, wet scrape of a shoe dragging against the asphalt. Someone was breathing heavily in the dark, hiding just out of sight. I froze, my muscles tensing as I peered into the absolute blackness. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, the rain continuing to beat down around me. And that is when a hand lunged out of the darkness and grabbed my coat. I stumbled backward, my leather shoes slipping on the wet concrete. A sharp gasp tore from my throat as a heavy, desperate weight pulled me into the narrow gap between the freezing steel shipping containers. My first instinct was to fight back. I am 70 years old, but I am not a frail man. I raised my fists ready to strike, but the figure clinging to me collapsed against my chest. The smell hit me before I could see his face. It was a foul mixture of stale seawater, cheap tobacco, and fresh coppery blood. The man was practically hanging off my lapels, his breath coming in ragged, shallow wheezes. Under the faint, flickering glow of a distant harbor light, I finally saw him clearly. He was young, maybe 30, with a face severely battered and bruised. Intricate dark tattoos crept up his neck, disappearing behind his soaked, filthy collar. These were not the markings of a common dock worker. They were the brutal insignia of the Eastern European smuggling rings that haunted the international waters. He was shivering violently, his eyes darting frantically toward the open pier behind me. "Are you Callahan?" He choked out, his accent thick and heavy. "Richard Callahan." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "I am Richard Callahan. Where is my son? Where is Tyler?" The man coughed a wet, sickening sound, and his grip on my coat tightened. He did not answer my question directly. Instead, his trembling, blood-stained hand reached into the deep pocket of his canvas jacket. I tensed, preparing for a weapon, but he pulled out a small metallic object. With a final surge of strength, he shoved it hard into the palm of my hand and clamped my fingers tightly around it. The metal was freezing cold and slick with the rain and his blood. I pulled my hand back, stepping out just far enough into the ambient light to see what he had given me. My breath hitched. Time simply ceased to exist. The heavy downpour, the groaning ships, the shivering smuggler at my feet, it all faded into a deafening silence. Resting in my palm was a silver Zippo lighter. It was tarnished, scratched, and coated in a thin layer of grime, but the distinctive weight and shape were unmistakable. My thumb numbly brushed over the surface, wiping away a smear of blood to reveal the custom engraving on the casing. From Dad to Tyler, age 20. A physical wave of nausea washed over me. 15 years ago, on a quiet Tuesday evening, I had stood in the warmth of my private study with a glass of scotch in one hand and this exact lighter in the other. Tyler had just turned 20. He was packing his bags for a celebratory yacht trip across the Atlantic with his college friends. I had handed him this silver Zippo, a replica of the one my own father had given me as a rite of passage. Tyler had smiled, flicked the lid open with that sharp metallic click, and promised to bring it back safely. That was the very last time I ever saw my boy alive. The Coast Guard had explicitly told me that the fire on the yacht had burned at over 2,000 degrees. They said nothing survived the blaze. They said my son had perished before the vessel even sank. Yet here I was, standing in the freezing rain 15 years later, holding the very item that was supposed to be resting in ashes at the bottom of the ocean. It was real. It was tangible. The silver dug into my palm, grounding me in a reality that defied all logic. "Where did you get this?" I demanded, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous command. I grabbed the smuggler by his collar and hauled him upward, pinning him against the corrugated steel wall of the shipping container. "Tell me where he is." The man grimaced in pain, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with me. He looked past my shoulder, scanning the dark harbor. "He is alive," the smuggler whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. Those 3 words hit me with the force of a freight train. He has been in the dark for a long time. They kept him. They kept all of them. Who? I shouted, shaking him. Who kept him? "The syndicate," the man choked out, blood spilling from his lips. "They found the boat. They took the boys. Sea slaves. No names. No faces. Just labor." The truth was so monstrous, so deeply horrifying, that my brain struggled to process it. My son had not died in a tragic accident. He had been stolen. While I was sitting in boardrooms expanding my wealth and securing my corporate legacy, my eldest son was chained in the belly of some illegal fishing trawler, stripped of his identity, and worked like an animal. 15 years of unimaginable suffering. 15 years of hoping his father would find him. "Where is he right now?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. The fire of grief inside me had instantly morphed into a cold, calculating rage. I was going to tear this harbor apart piece by piece if I had to. "The freighter," the smuggler wheezed, pointing a trembling finger toward the deep water docks at the far end of the pier. "The rusted ship. They are moving him tonight. The operation is compromised. They are clearing the inventory. If he gets on that ship, he goes to the international waters. You will never find him again. You have to stop them." His words were abruptly cut off. A blinding pair of headlights suddenly ignited at the end of the alleyway, cutting through the heavy rain like searchlights. The harsh glare illuminated the narrow space between the containers, blinding me temporarily. Before I could react, the deep guttural roar of a massive engine echoed through the corridor. A black SUV with completely tinted windows and no license plates accelerated out of the shadows. It did not swerve. It did not brake. It barreled straight toward us with lethal, terrifying speed. "Look out!" the smuggler screamed. He shoved me backward with a sudden, violent force. I flew out of the path of the vehicle, crashing hard onto the wet, unforgiving asphalt. The impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs, and my head slammed against a wooden pallet. Through my blurred vision, I watched in sheer horror as the heavy SUV slammed directly into the smuggler. The sickening thud of metal striking bone echoed over the storm. The man was caught under the heavy front grille, dragged violently across the rough concrete. The driver did not even touch the brakes. The vehicle sped out of the alley, rounding the corner of the harbor, and vanishing into the pitch-black night as quickly as it had appeared. The only evidence it had ever been there was the fresh, dark streak of blood washing away in the rain. I stood frozen in the relentless downpour, the deafening roar of the black SUV fading into the distance. The alleyway was suddenly empty, save for the heavy sheet of rain and the dark spreading stain on the wet asphalt. The smuggler was gone, dragged away into the night before he could finish his sentence. My chest heaved as I struggled to pull oxygen into my lungs. My hands, trembling violently, gripped the cold, blood-stained silver lighter. I stared at the engraved words. From Dad to Tyler, age 20. It was not a ghost. It was not a hallucination brought on by a desperate, aging mind. The metallic weight in my palm was absolute proof. I stumbled out of the dark alley, my expensive wool coat clinging heavily to my soaked shoulders. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my truck, locked the doors, and sat in the dark for a long time. My mind raced through the smuggler's final gasping words. Sea slaves. International waters. They are moving him tonight. The operation is compromised. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My son, my flesh and blood, had been trapped in a floating hell for 15 years, and tonight he had tried to reach out to me. And whoever held him captive had just murdered a man right in front of my eyes to keep that secret buried. I shoved the key into the ignition and sped away from the harbor, leaving the nightmare behind, but bringing the evidence with me. The drive back to the estate was a blur of flashing traffic lights and rain-streaked windows. I needed help. I needed my family. We needed to contact the authorities, hire private security, do whatever it took to tear the ocean apart and find that ship. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of my home and slammed the brakes in the circular driveway. I did not bother with the umbrella. I bolted through the front doors, the heavy oak slamming shut behind me, echoing loudly through the grand, silent foyer. I took the sweeping marble staircase 2 steps at a time, my wet shoes leaving a trail of water and faint traces of blood on the pristine carpet. I pushed open the double doors to the master bedroom. The room was warm, dimly lit by the security floodlights outside. Monica was still fast asleep, her breathing slow and rhythmic beneath the heavy silk comforter. "Monica," I said, my voice cracking as I approached the edge of the mattress. "Monica, wake up." She stirred, groaning softly as she turned over. She slowly opened her eyes, squinting against the darkness. "Richard," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "What time is it? Why are you all wet?" I sat on the edge of the bed and reached over, turning on the bedside lamp. The sudden burst of light illuminated my pale, rain-soaked face and my trembling hands. I held out the silver Zippo lighter. The blood on the casing had started to dry, turning into a dark, rusty crimson. Monica stared at it, her brow furrowing in confusion. "He is alive," I choked out the words, tearing through my throat. "Monica, Tyler is alive. He called me." For a fraction of a second, A strange, unreadable expression flashed across her face. It was so fast I barely registered it. But then her eyes widened to an unnatural degree. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. What she whispered, her voice trembling. "Richard, what are you saying? That is impossible." I got a phone call. I explained the words tumbling out of me in a frantic rush. It was his voice. He told me he was at Pier 4. I drove down there, Monica. I went to the docks. He was not there, but a man found me. A smuggler. He gave me this lighter. Tyler's lighter. The one I gave him the night before the fire. The man told me Tyler was sold. He has been held captive on a cargo ship for 15 years, and they are moving him tonight. Monica stared at the lighter, her breathing growing rapid and shallow. And then the performance began. It was absolute perfection. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail that seemed to tear from the very bottom of her soul. She collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. "No," she cried out, her voice muffled by her tears. "No, it cannot be. Oh my God, Richard. Tyler. My poor boy." She threw her arms around my neck, clinging to me as if her legs had completely given out. She wept loudly, her tears mixing with the rainwater on my coat. I held her, feeling a surge of protective instinct. She had raised Tyler alongside me since he was a teenager. She had mourned him just as fiercely as I had. Or so I believed. The sheer volume of her sobs echoed through the quiet hallway. A moment later, the bedroom door swung open. Derek stood in the doorway wearing a pair of sweatpants and a plain gray t-shirt, his hair ruffled from sleep. "Dad, what is going on?" Derek asked, stepping quickly into the room. "Is Mom okay?" I heard screaming. I pulled back from Monica, wiping the rain from my face. I stood up and walked over to my youngest son. Derek had always been the logical one, the calm and collected operational mind of my company. I held out the bloody silver lighter to him. His eyes locked onto it, and his jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Your brother is alive," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of hope and terror. "I got a call tonight. I went to the harbor. A man gave me this and told me Tyler has been held captive by a smuggling ring for 15 years. They killed the man right in front of me, Derek. A black SUV ran him down in the alley. They are moving Tyler tonight. We have to call the federal authorities. We have to stop that ship." Derek did not react with shock. He did not gasp or stumble backward. Instead, he stepped fully into the room, exuding an aura of calm, rational authority. He gently took the silver lighter from my shaking hand. He turned it over under the lamplight, examining the engraved letters and the dried blood. He let out a long, heavy sigh and looked up at me. His eyes were completely steady, filled with a deep, sorrowful pity. "Dad, please sit down," Derek said, his voice smooth and remarkably steady. "I do not want to sit down." I fired back, my frustration rising. "We are losing time. Every second we stand here, that ship gets further away from the coastline. We have to act now." Derek reached out and placed a firm, grounding hand on my shoulder. He squeezed gently, forcing me to look him squarely in the eye. "Dad, listen to me. Tyler is not alive. You need to breathe and listen to what I am telling you. This is a scam." I stared at him, bewildered. "A scam?" I heard his voice, Derek. I know my own son's voice. "You heard a digital fabrication," Derek replied, his tone patient, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a confused child. "Dad, you are a billionaire. You own one of the largest shipping and logistics firms on the West Coast. Do you have any idea how much of a target you are? Russian crime syndicates are using incredibly advanced artificial intelligence right now. They scrape audio from old home videos, voicemails, anything they can find, and they clone the voice perfectly. They target grieving families with deep pockets. It is a known extortion tactic." I shook my head violently, pointing at the object in his hand. "What about the lighter? Explain the lighter. How could they possibly have that if he died in the fire?" Derek looked at the lighter, his expression hardening into grim certainty. The yacht burned, Dad, but it did not vaporize into thin air. Wreckage washed up on the shores. Scavengers and criminal divers search those wreck sites all the time looking for valuables. Someone found this lighter years ago and kept it. They waited for the right moment. They knew you never found a body. They knew you would be desperate enough to believe anything. They lured you to a dark harbor at 3 a.m. to terrify you. The man getting run over. It was probably a staged hit or just violent gang retaliation that you walked into. They want you panicked. They want you willing to pay any ransom they demand tomorrow morning. I stood there in the center of the bedroom, my chest heaving. The sheer logic of his words hit me like a physical blow. It was completely plausible. I was a wealthy man. The technology he described existed. The extortion plot made terrifying sense. Monica continued to weep softly on the bed, her face buried in the pillows. Derek kept his firm grip on my shoulder, playing the role of the protective, rational son flawlessly. He looked at me with such genuine concern that I almost believed him. But as I stared into his eyes, a tiny freezing seed of doubt planted itself deep in my stomach. Before I could challenge my son, soft padded footsteps echoed from the wide hallway. The heavy door to the master suite was pushed open a little wider. Samantha, Derek's second wife, stood in the threshold. Wrapped in an emerald silk robe, her arms were crossed over her chest. Her dark hair was perfectly arranged, undisturbed by sleep. She did not look like a woman who had just been violently jolted awake by an unexpected emergency. She looked profoundly annoyed, her sharp, angular features permanently set in a deep scowl. "What is going on in here?" Samantha demanded, her voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. I could hear the screaming down the hall. "We have an early morning tomorrow, Derek." Derek kept his grip planted on my shoulder. "Dad had a bad scare tonight, Samantha. He got a prank call, someone claiming to be Tyler. They lured him to the shipping yards and tried to shake him down. He is shaken up, but it is over. We are handling it." Samantha did not gasp. She did not rush over to comfort Monica. Instead, her sharp eyes darted down to the blood-stained silver lighter, resting heavily on the nightstand. She stared at it for a long second, and I watched her jaw clench. It was a minuscule physical reaction, a fleeting shadow of raw tension that vanished quickly. But I spent my entire professional life reading dangerous people in boardrooms. I knew exactly what a calculated emotional recovery looked like. "A prank call," Samantha repeated. She walked slowly over to the edge of the bed and looked down at me. Her expression was devoid of sympathy, entirely focused on a different problem. "Richard, do you realize what week this is?" I looked up, feeling a strange disconnect from reality. "Samantha," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I heard him. It was Tyler. He was begging for my help. They have him on a ship. Samantha let out an exasperated, exhausted sigh, tightly pinching the bridge of her nose. "Richard, stop this madness right now. You did not hear Tyler. Tyler has been definitively dead for 15 long years. We all know this. What you heard was a cheap digital scam. And what you are doing right now is extremely undeniably dangerous." "Dangerous," I echoed, my heavy brow furrowing in confusion. "My son is out there. How is wanting to find him considered dangerous?" "Because you are completely spiraling." "Richard," she snapped loudly. "You are 70 years old. You have been working 80-hour weeks, constantly preparing for the biggest corporate expansion in our history. The initial public offering is only 6 days away. Billions of our dollars are on the line. The entire global industry is watching. The immense stress is making you hallucinate." I blinked, stunned by her callousness. "Hallucinate? I am not hallucinating, Samantha." I held a dying man in my arms. He bled on my coat. "Look at it." I pointed at the dark stains. He gave me the lighter. "It is a prop," Samantha said casually, dismissing the horror. "It is used by common street criminals who prey on the weak. They aggressively researched your family history, digitally, cloned a voice, and bought a vintage lighter to totally mess with your head. And it worked. Look at yourself right now. You are a billionaire chief executive standing here dripping freezing wet, raving about ghost ships and dead suns. Derek stepped closer to his wife, nodding. She is right, Dad. You have been under immense pressure lately. The IPO has taken a massive toll on your mental health. This extortion attempt just pushed you over the edge. Samantha leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a dark, threatening register. Let me be completely clear with you, Richard. If the board of directors hears that their chief executive is running around the harbor docks, chasing dangerous phantoms, they will panic. They will clearly see a man losing his fragile grip on reality. They will instantly force a medical evaluation and forcefully vote you out. Everything you have personally built will be handed over to a corporate receiver. I stood in the bedroom, the heavy rain lashing against the glass windows behind me. The silence became absolute, broken only by Monica's manufactured weeping. I looked at the three of them. My fragile wife, my protective son, my ruthless daughter-in-law. They had formed a perfect wall around me. The logic they presented was flawless. The corporate threat was real. If the board believed I was experiencing a severe psychotic break, they would permanently strip me of my power within 24 fast hours. I would be completely legally neutralized while my company and vast wealth were heavily controlled by Derek and Samantha. It was a brilliant, masterful performance. They were actively using my immense grief as a blunt weapon. If I fought them right now, if I foolishly insisted on calling the federal authorities, they would execute their plan. They would swiftly have me declared mentally unfit. And while I fought for my own autonomy, that rusted cargo ship carrying my firstborn son would smoothly sail into international waters, disappearing into the dark ocean. I needed time. I needed freedom of movement. And most importantly, I needed them to believe that they had won. I needed them to think that their psychological manipulation had successfully broken me down. I let out a ragged breath, letting my shoulders slump. I allowed the exhaustion to wash over my face. The freezing seed of doubt in my stomach had blossomed into a cold, terrifying certainty. These people were not my family. They were my wardens, and they were hiding something monstrous. I raised my head and looked at Derek, forcing my eyes to soften. "You are right," I whispered. "I am just a tired old man." Derek exhaled the tension leaving his shoulders. He pulled me into an embrace. "It is okay, Dad. We will take care of you. We will make sure these scammers never bother you again." I nodded, slowly pulling away. I placed a hand on Monica's shoulder. She squeezed my fingers. "I am sorry I woke you," I murmured. "I will go to the guest room so you can sleep." Samantha watched me with a look of smug satisfaction. "Get some rest, Richard. Everything will look clearer in the morning. We need you sharp for the board meeting on Tuesday." I turned away and walked slowly out of the master suite, dragging my feet to complete the illusion of a broken man. I closed the heavy door, stepping into the dark hallway of my mansion. The second the latch clicked, the illusion vanished. My posture straightened. The trembling in my hands ceased. My breathing steadied. The overwhelming grief that had blinded me was gone, replaced by an icy, calculated focus. Inside my chest, a heavy iron switch flipped. I walked down the corridor, my mind working through the logistics of the silent war I was about to wage. They thought I was a clueless, aging relic. They had fatally underestimated the dangerous man who had built this sprawling empire from absolutely nothing. I was not going to call the police. I was going to systematically dismantle their operation, unearth their darkest secrets, and find out exactly what happened to my son 15 years ago. And when I uncovered the truth, I would burn their privileged lives to the ground. I reached the guest room, stepped inside, and locked the heavy door. I looked out at the pouring rain. The silent hunt had officially begun right now. I walked very slowly into my private study, a sprawling room lined with dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass that overlooked the entire rear estate. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut, the carefully constructed facade of the exhausted, confused old man dissolved completely. I stood tall, rolling my shoulders to release the deep tension that had coiled in my muscles during that sickening performance in the master bedroom. My mind was racing, cataloging every single word, every micro-expression, every calculated breath Monica, Derek, and Samantha had just taken. They had rehearsed that response. They had anticipated this exact scenario, and that realization alone was enough to turn the blood in my veins to ice. I did not turn on the lights. I preferred the darkness. It had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could think without the intrusive glare of the world demanding my attention. I walked over to the massive window that offered a panoramic view of the sprawling gardens, the infinity pool, and the vast, churning waters of the Puget Sound beyond. The storm was still raging outside, the wind battering the glass with a relentless, rhythmic force. I stood there, a silent shadow in my own home, watching the rain wash over the stone patios. My study was strategically positioned. It shared an architectural angle with the east wing of the mansion, giving me an unobstructed, voyeuristic view of the wraparound balcony connected to Derek and Samantha's private suite. They did not know I often stood here when I could not sleep, watching the distant city lights. They assumed I was just a naive, frail, rich old man safely tucked away in my bed, dreaming of a peaceful retirement. As I stared out into the bleak night, a sudden sliver of warm yellow light sliced across the wet stone of the east wing balcony. The heavy glass door slid open, and a figure stepped out into the freezing downpour. It was Derek. He was no longer wearing the calm, collected mask he had worn in my bedroom just 10 minutes prior. The rational, protective son who had so smoothly explained away the bloody lighter and the desperate phone call was completely gone. In his place was a man on the very precipice of a total psychological collapse. I stepped closer to the glass, the cold surface radiating against my face. The heavy soundproof panels blocked out all ambient noise, leaving me to watch this silent, frantic pantomime unfold. Derek paced back and forth across the slick balcony, completely ignoring the freezing rain that was rapidly soaking his expensive sleepwear. He raised his left hand to his mouth, gnawing nervously on his thumbnail, a childhood habit he only displayed when he was cornered and knew he had no way out. With his right hand, he reached into the deep pocket of his sweatpants and pulled out a small, blocky object. It was not his sleek, modern smartphone. It was thick, outdated, and entirely utilitarian. A burner phone. My billionaire son, the chief operating officer of a global logistics empire, was standing in the freezing rain at 4 a.m, using an untraceable prepaid cell phone. He hastily dialed a number, his fingers stabbing at the keypad with a chaotic, uncoordinated energy. He pressed the phone to his ear, his shoulders hunched upward, as if trying to physically shield himself from an invisible blow. I watched his face illuminated by the harsh ambient light spilling from the open balcony door. The person on the other end answered. Derek began to speak, his mouth moving in rapid, frantic bursts. I could not hear a single syllable, but his body language screamed volumes. He was not giving orders. He was not demanding answers. He was begging. He was pleading with someone, his free hand chopping through the air in desperate, erratic motions. He pulled a polished silver cigar tube from his pocket, likely a nervous reflex, an attempt to anchor himself to a familiar calming habit. He extracted a thick, imported cigar, but his hands were shaking so violently that he could not even secure it between his lips. The tremors racked his entire frame, starting from his shoulders and vibrating all the way down to his fingertips. He fumbled with a gold lighter, trying to ignite the flame, but his thumb kept slipping off the striker wheel. In a sudden, explosive fit of frustration and raw terror, his grip failed entirely. The expensive cigar slipped from his trembling fingers, tumbling over the glass railing and disappearing into the dark, churning waters of the pool below. Derek did not even watch it fall. He just gripped the burner phone tighter, pressing it so hard against his ear that his knuckles turned a stark bone white. He squeezed his dark eyes shut, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths as he listened to whoever was speaking on the other end of that line. I stood frozen in the dark study, my eyes locked on my youngest son. In the brutal, unforgiving world of corporate logistics, you learn to read people, You learn to strip away the words they say and focus entirely on the physiological reactions their bodies cannot hide. I had spent 50 years negotiating with ruthless competitors, navigating hostile takeovers, and breaking men who thought they held all the cards. I knew what anger looked like. I knew what annoyance looked like. And I knew exactly what pure, unadulterated terror looked like. If Derek truly believed the fabricated narrative he had just sold me, if he honestly thought I had simply received a malicious prank call from a Russian extortion ring, he would be annoyed. He would be aggressively calling our corporate security director. He would be pacing that balcony with a scowl, annoyed that an external threat was attempting to disrupt his carefully planned initial public offering. He would be focused on mitigating a financial risk. But the man standing on that balcony was not annoyed. He was fighting for his actual life. His eyes were wide and hollow. His body was folded inward, completely consumed by the kind of primal fear that only strikes a man when he realizes a terrible, unforgiving trap has finally snapped shut around his throat. The call ended abruptly. Derek lowered the burner phone, staring down at it as if it were a venomous snake. He leaned heavily against the wet glass railing, burying his face in his hands, his entire body convulsing with what looked like silent, agonizing sobs. I stepped back from the window, retreating into the comforting shadows of my study. My mind was a cold, calculating machine, sorting through the data, aligning the facts, and drawing the only logical, terrifying conclusion. Derek was terrified because the call I received was real. He was terrified because the bloody silver lighter sitting on the nightstand across the hall was real. And most importantly, my youngest son was displaying the sheer raw panic of a cornered rat who realizes his ultimate deception is about to unravel entirely. But what exactly was he hiding now, and how deep did this unimaginable, horrific betrayal truly go? But what exactly was he hiding now, and how deep did this unimaginable, horrific betrayal truly go? The harsh light of early morning finally broke through the heavy, oppressive gray clouds, casting long, pale shadows across the polished hardwood floors of my sprawling estate. The relentless, violent storm that had battered the city of Seattle all night had finally passed, leaving behind a bitter, cold, damp silence that seemed to completely suffocate every single room in the mansion. I had not slept a single solitary second. I had remained completely immobile in my massive study, sitting rigidly in the heavy leather chair behind my desk, staring blindly at the dark oak-paneled walls. My mind was a terrifying, exhausting labyrinth of fragmented memories, horrifying possibilities, and a continuously growing monstrous realization that I was currently living inside a carefully constructed, masterful lie. The haunting image of Derek shaking uncontrollably on the balcony was permanently and painfully burned into my retinas. The sheer, unadulterated panic in his wide eyes definitively proved that my youngest son was a vital, active part of this terrifying nightmare. But I deeply needed to know about Monica. I desperately needed to know if the beautiful woman I had intimately shared my bed with for nearly 2 decades, the woman who had wept so convincingly and so loudly in my arms just a few brief hours ago, was also heavily complicit in this unimaginable horror. I needed absolute, undeniable physical proof, and as I sat there in the chilling morning silence, I knew exactly how to easily get it. I slowly looked down at the heavy, blood-stained silver Zippo lighter that was currently resting quietly on the pristine surface of my dark desk. The dried, crusty blood of the brutally murdered dock smuggler was still thickly smeared across the deeply engraved metal letters. It was the only physical piece of hard evidence directly connecting me to the terrifying truth that Tyler was still out there suffering in the dark. I began to form a simple yet highly effective psychological test. If my family truly believed the false narrative they had so forcefully and aggressively sold me last night, if they honestly and genuinely thought this silver lighter was absolutely nothing more than a cheap, discarded prop used by a highly sophisticated Russian extortion ring, they would simply ignore it entirely. They would view it as a painfully distasteful, highly toxic reminder of a cruel, emotionally damaging scam and purposely leave it completely alone. But if they were actively hiding something deeply and profoundly sinister, if they secretly knew this lighter was totally authentic and represented a genuine, extremely dangerous threat to their carefully protected secrets, they would definitely not be able to tolerate its existence. They would feel an overwhelming, urgent need to eradicate it completely and permanently. I slowly stood up, my old joints feeling incredibly stiff from the long, agonizingly sleepless night, and confidently walked over to the intricately woven brass wastebasket situated directly near the heavy mahogany door. I deliberately and very slowly dropped the silver lighter inside. It landed with a dull, hollow metallic thud, sitting clearly and obviously visible right against the dark metal grating at the very bottom. I quietly left the study, pulling the heavy door almost completely shut, intentionally leaving only a very narrow, vertical crack of empty space, just wide enough for me to securely observe the entire room from the outside hallway. I stepped silently back into the adjacent reading alcove, blending myself perfectly and completely into the deep, dark shadows cast by the towering antique bookshelves. The morning silence in the massive mansion was heavy, dense, and profoundly oppressive. I stood there perfectly still, tightly controlling my shallow breathing, nervously, waiting for the large house to finally begin its standard morning routine. Time seemed to stretch into a brutally agonizing, impossible crawl. Every single rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock, located down in the main foyer, felt like a heavy physical hammer, striking directly against my tired chest. Finally, after what genuinely felt like several agonizing hours of silent isolation, I clearly heard the soft, distinctly muted padding of expensive slippers slowly descending the grand staircase. It was Monica. Her physical movements were usually very graceful, lethargic, and incredibly slow in the mornings, but today her rapid steps were notably sharp, exceptionally quick, and clearly driven by a quiet, extremely nervous energy. I pressed my shoulder firmly against the cold plaster wall, tightly holding my breath, as her rapid footsteps drew closer and closer to my study. She paused abruptly right outside the mahogany door. Through the extremely narrow crack, I intently watched her perfectly manicured hand rest hesitantly on the cold brass handle. She pushed the heavy door open just slightly, carefully, peering deeply into the dark room to absolutely ensure that I was not currently sitting at my large desk. Falsely believing she was completely and totally alone, she quickly slipped inside, closing the heavy door just enough to fully shield herself from the main corridor, completely and blissfully unaware of my silent, watchful presence hiding in the deep shadows. I watched my beautiful wife incredibly closely. The devastating, earth-shattering grief she had dramatically displayed in our master bedroom only a few short hours ago had completely and entirely vanished, without a single trace. There were absolutely no tears, no trembling lips, no dramatic signs of a grieving, heartbroken, mourning mother. Her face was firmly set in a hard, rigid, utterly terrifying mask of pure, cold calculation. Her sharp, highly alert eyes immediately scanned the entire room, darting rapidly from the massive desk to the tall bookshelves until they finally locked completely onto the brass wastebasket. She stepped rapidly forward, her intense gaze fixed entirely and exclusively on the blood-stained silver lighter, resting quietly at the very bottom. If she truly and honestly believed it was a fake prop from a dangerous scammer, she would have simply looked away in profound disgust and loudly called for the dedicated housekeeping staff to completely remove the trash. But her immediate physical reaction was completely and entirely different. Her upper lip curled forcefully backward in a nasty, deeply ugly sneer of absolute, unadulterated contempt. It was a terrifying look of pure, highly venomous hatred that chilled my aging body to the very marrow of my bones. She absolutely did not reach in to grab it with her bare hands. Instead, she quickly and aggressively pulled a delicate silk handkerchief from the deep pocket of her expensive morning robe. She leaned sharply over the brass basket and angrily snatched the heavy silver lighter, immediately wrapping it tightly and securely in the soft fabric, as if the mere physical touch of it would violently burn her bare skin. She clutched it highly aggressively against her chest, her knuckles instantly turning a stark white, her dark eyes blazing wildly with a fierce, incredibly aggressive purpose. She spun swiftly around and marched very briskly toward the door. I silently and carefully retreated much deeper into the dark shadows of the reading alcove as she hurried rapidly out of the study and headed straight down the long carpeted corridor toward the main kitchen. I patiently waited 3 long seconds before smoothly stepping out of my dark hiding place. I moved completely silently over the plush, expensive carpet, carefully following her distant, highly purposeful footsteps. The main kitchen was a massive, sprawling, pristine room filled entirely with imported white marble countertops and heavy industrial-grade cooking appliances. I stopped cautiously just outside the large arched entryway, actively keeping myself completely and totally hidden safely behind the thick, solid wall. I very cautiously leaned my body forward, peering quietly around the sharp corner to carefully watch her every single move. Monica stood rigidly in front of the deep stainless steel sink. She quickly unwrapped the silver lighter from her silk handkerchief, staring coldly down at the deeply engraved words one very last silent time. There was absolutely no hesitation. There was no lingering, painful sorrow. She aggressively dropped the heavy metal object directly down into the gaping dark drain of the heavy-duty industrial garbage disposal unit. The loud, sharp, metallic clatter echoed harshly against the quiet kitchen walls. Without missing a single solitary beat, she quickly reached out her hand and aggressively flipped the heavy electrical wall switch. The incredibly powerful disposal engine roared instantly to life with a deafening, wildly violent grind. The absolutely horrific, deeply terrifying sound of thick-tempered steel, aggressively chewing through solid metal, violently filled the air. A high-pitched, highly agonizing screech of total physical destruction that made my tired stomach aggressively and painfully churn. Bright orange sparks briefly and violently illuminated the dark sink drain as the heavy machine viciously and completely tore the silver Zippo apart, totally shredding the absolute only remaining physical proof of my firstborn son into tiny, unrecognizable, completely destroyed metal fragments. Monica stood perfectly still, heavily leaning her delicate hands against the cold marble counter, silently watching the dark drain with an intense, deeply disturbing satisfaction. A profound, undeniably genuine look of pure, absolute relief washed completely and totally over her entire face. She slowly closed her eyes and let out a very long, highly satisfied, heavy exhale, acting exactly as if a massive, deeply life-threatening burden had just been permanently removed from her shoulders forever. I slowly pulled my head backward from the large archway, firmly pressing my spine completely flat against the cold, hard corridor wall. The violently loud, aggressive grinding noise of the disposal machine finally stopped entirely rapidly, replaced by the quiet, highly mundane sound of rushing tap water. The carefully constructed, completely fabricated family mask was now totally, permanently off forever. My beloved wife and my youngest son were absolutely not innocent victims of a complicated, highly sophisticated extortion plot. They were the actual deeply sinister masterminds actively hiding a devastating, completely world-shattering secret. I slowly closed my eyes tightly, completely accepting the brutal, incredibly horrifying reality. My family had truly become my absolute worst, most dangerous enemies. I remained pressed against the cold corridor wall for several long minutes, allowing the bitter truth to fully settle into my bones. The mansion around me was no longer a home. It was a beautifully decorated prison housing the architects of my profound suffering. I needed absolute concrete data, something more substantial than a destroyed silver lighter. I retreated silently to the guest bedroom, stripped off my damp clothes, and changed into a sharp, tailored business suit. I tied my silk tie with hands that no longer trembled with grief, but moved with a cold, mechanical precision. I had built a global empire by ruthlessly analyzing data and executing strategic strikes. I was about to apply those exact same skills to my own flesh and blood. I walked out of the mansion and stepped into the dimly lit garage. I bypassed my usual daily driver and took the keys to a discreet, dark gray sedan. The heavy rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle as I navigated the winding roads of my exclusive neighborhood. The drive toward downtown Seattle was a blur of slick asphalt and gray morning light. My destination was Callahan Logistics, the towering glass and steel monolith that served as the beating heart of my international shipping empire. I arrived at the underground executive parking structure just before 6 in the morning, long before the regular corporate staff would begin their daily routines. The vast garage was completely empty. I parked the car in a dark corner, ensuring my arrival would remain completely unnoticed. I rode the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. The polished chrome doors slid open, revealing a silent, immaculate reception area bathed in soft, artificial light. I walked purposefully down the long, carpeted corridor. I stopped in front of the heavy glass doors that led into the Chief Operating Officer suite. Derek's name was proudly displayed on the frosted glass in elegant, bold silver lettering. I stood there staring at his name, allowing a wave of profound, burning anger to wash over me. Exactly 5 years ago, I had proudly promoted him to this prestigious position. I had explicitly trusted him to manage the highly complex, incredibly lucrative global shipping routes. I had foolishly believed my legacy was safe in his young, capable hands. I bypassed his office and walked directly into the secured server room located at the far end of the executive floor. As the founder and chief executive, my biometric credentials granted me absolute unrestricted access to every single byte of data flowing through the company mainframe. I pressed my thumb against the glowing green scanner. The heavy security door clicked open, admitting me into the freezing room, filled with towering rows of blinking server racks. I sat down at the master terminal, a sleek console that controlled the entire global network. I took a deep breath and began to type. I bypassed the standard operational dashboards and dug deeply into the heavily encrypted long-term archived shipping logs. I was searching for any subtle logistical anomaly that Derek might have buried within millions of lines of routine maritime code. I started pulling this detailed tracking data for our older, less prominent cargo freighters, the massive aging vessels that handled bulk transport across the most desolate stretches of the open ocean. For the first hour, everything appeared completely normal. The ships moved from port to port, registering routine fuel consumption, standard cargo weights, and predictable maritime weather delays. Derek was a meticulous, highly intelligent operator. He would have covered his tracks with layers of boring, mundane corporate bureaucracy. I narrowed my search parameters, specifically filtering the data to highlight any unexpected deviations in speed, unscheduled maintenance stops, or sudden drops in satellite communication. I meticulously cross-referenced thousands of individual travel manifests, searching for a tiny flaw in his otherwise flawless digital armor. The silence of the server room was broken only by the rapid clicking of my keyboard. Right around 7 in the morning, a glaring, highly irregular pattern finally emerged on the screen. It started as a minor discrepancy in fuel consumption reports for a rusty, aging freighter named the Iron Vanguard. According to the official corporate manifest, the ship was traveling a direct, uninterrupted route from Rotterdam to a minor industrial port in South America. But the raw telemetry data told a completely different, deeply troubling story. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my eyes narrowing as I cross-referenced the digital coordinates. The Iron Vanguard was not traveling in a straight line. Every 3 months, the massive ship would abruptly deviate from its official shipping lane. It would venture hundreds of miles off course, moving deep into unregulated international waters. Once it reached a specific highly remote location, the ship would kill its engines and float silently for exactly 4 hours. There was no documented reason for these stops. No weather events, no mechanical failures, no cargo transfers. They were ghost stops hidden from official records, but burned into the satellite telemetry. My heart began to pound against my ribs as I pulled up the data for other aging vessels in our vast fleet. The pattern repeated itself with terrifying consistency. The Ocean Drifter, the Seattle Star, the Atlantic King. Every single one of these ships was making the exact same undocumented stop in the exact same desolate sector of the ocean. Derek had been orchestrating this silent deviation for the entire 5 years he had been in charge of the global shipping routes. I needed to know where they were going. I needed to see what location was so important. My son was risking everything to visit it in secrecy. I highlighted the recurring coordinates on the master terminal and commanded the system to plot them onto a high-resolution maritime map. The screen flickered for a brief second before displaying a vast expanse of the open ocean. A bright red, blinking cursor slowly materialized on the map, pinpointing the exact location of the undocumented stops. I stared at that blinking red dot, and the air was instantly sucked right out of my lungs. The temperature in the server room seemed to plummet to absolute zero. A cold dread wrapped its icy fingers tightly around my throat, making it completely impossible to draw a breath. I knew those coordinates. I had stared at them on nautical maps for months after the tragic accident, desperately praying for a miracle that never came. The bright red cursor was hovering over a desolate sector of the mid-Atlantic. It was the exact location where Tyler's luxury vacation yacht had supposedly suffered a catastrophic engine fire 15 years ago. It was the maritime graveyard where I had been told my firstborn son had burned to death. My hands began to shake violently over the sleek keyboard. The horrifying truth was staring me right in the face. Tyler did not die in that fire. He was taken from that exact spot, and my own shipping company, operated by my youngest son, was routinely navigating back to that very same maritime sector. The implications were too sickening to fully process. The trap had been set, and I was going to tear the entire ocean apart to destroy it right now. I pulled an encrypted hard drive from the emergency kit secured in the bottom drawer of the master console. My hands moved with mechanical precision as I initiated a full mirror clone of the server database. Every shipping log, encrypted communication, and hidden financial transaction Derek had authorized over the past 5 years transferred onto the drive. I watched the green progress bar slowly inch forward, my mind completely consumed by a dark, suffocating rage. Once the transfer hit 100%, I pulled the drive free, slipped it into my suit, and walked out without looking back. I drove out of the corporate parking garage and headed toward the industrial outskirts of Seattle. The relentless storm had broken, leaving a thick fog settling heavily over the damp streets. My destination was an abandoned shipyard on the forgotten edge of the Duwamish waterway. It was a rotting monument to a bygone era, an expanse of cracked concrete and rusting cranes the city had long abandoned. I navigated my sedan through the rusted gates, parking deep inside the cavernous hull of an old assembly warehouse. The freezing air was incredibly thick, with the strong smell of stale engine oil and rusted wet iron. I killed the engine and stepped out into the echoing silence. A sleek black vehicle rolled silently into the warehouse, parking a few dozen yards away. The heavy door opened, and Bradley Hughes stepped out into the dim light. Bradley was 50 years old, a former special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who spent 2 decades hunting down the most ruthless syndicates on the western seaboard. We crossed paths often during my early years building the shipping empire. After he retired, I brought him on as my shadow fixer to handle delicate problems a billionaire could never make public. Bradley was the only man in this city I trusted more than my own blood. He walked toward me, his coat sweeping over the wet concrete. His sharp eyes immediately registered the tension radiating from my posture. He stopped a few feet away, hands resting casually in his pockets. "You called the emergency line, Richard," he said, his voice a low baritone that echoed faintly. "I have not heard that specific tone in your voice since the day we met. Tell me what has happened." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted hard drive. I held it out to him, my grip tight and unyielding. Bradley looked at the drive, then up at my face before taking it from my hand. I received a phone call at 3 o'clock this morning. I began my voice steady but laced with a burning intensity. It was Tyler. He is alive, Bradley. Bradley did not display any overt shock. His rigorous training kept his facial features neutral, but I saw the sudden tightening of his jawline. Tyler has been dead for 15 years. Richard, he replied carefully. We both read the final fire analysis. I thought so, I said, but I drove down to Pier 4. A smuggler found me in the dark. He physically gave me the exact silver Zippo lighter I gave Tyler the night before that yacht caught fire. The smuggler told me Tyler was pulled from the water by mercenaries and sold into the sea slave trade. He has been chained in the dark for 15 years. And right before the smuggler could tell me the rest, a black vehicle ran him down and silenced him forever. Bradley looked down at the hard drive, processing the terrifying implications of my words. And this drive, he asked. That drive contains the cloned archive of my corporate shipping logs for the past 5 years, I explained. I bypassed my son Derek's administrative access. I found a recurring, highly hidden pattern of ghost stops. Our older massive bulk cargo freighters have been regularly and intentionally deviating from their official shipping lanes. They have been dropping anchor in the exact sector of the Atlantic where Tyler's yacht supposedly burned to the waterline. Derek has been using my ships to interact with the syndicate that took my son. Bradley closed his hand around the hard drive, slipping it securely into his coat. Have you confronted Derek about this? Have you spoken to Monica? I told them all about the desperate phone call and the bloody lighter, I replied. They put on a masterful, deeply disturbing performance. They tried to convince me I was suffering from a psychotic break. They claimed Russian extortionists were using artificial intelligence to clone Tyler's voice. They wanted me to believe I was hallucinating, so they could easily declare me mentally incompetent and seize total control of the company. Bradley exhaled a long breath, the condensation pluming in the freezing air. They are actively managing the cover-up, he stated factually. They are trying to neutralize you before you can dismantle their logistical network. Exactly, I said. And that is why I need you to completely dismantle it for me. I need to know every secret they are hiding inside my own home. I stepped right up to him, looking deeply into his cold eyes. I am authorizing you to bypass all legal protocols, Bradley. I do not care about warrants. I do not care about privacy laws. I do not care about legal liability. I want you to unleash your entire team on my estate immediately. I want Derek's personal phone and his corporate phone fully cloned. I want a geographic tracker hidden deep inside his Porsche. And most importantly, I want their private master bedroom completely bugged with military-grade audio surveillance. By tonight. Bradley did not blink. He simply stared at me, evaluating the weight of what I was commanding him to do. He knew exactly what this meant. We were crossing a dangerous, completely irreversible line. We were treating my wife and my youngest son like targets in a federal racketeering investigation. Richard, he said, his voice dropping into a solemn warning. If I execute these orders, if I put my team inside your house and wiretap your family, we are opening a door that can never be closed. Whatever we find on those audio feeds, whatever monstrous truth is hiding in those digital logs, you will have to look at it directly. You will have to live with the devastating reality of what your own blood has done. If we dig into this terrifying darkness, there is absolutely no turning back. Are you truly prepared for that? I looked around the decaying shipyard, listening to the water dripping from the massive steel beams above our heads. I thought about the unimaginable suffering my firstborn son had endured while I sat comfortably in my heated mansion. The burning rage inside my chest completely consumed whatever lingering paternal affection I had left for the parasites living under my roof. I looked back at Bradley, my expression hardening into an unbreakable, freezing mask of absolute resolve. I lost my son 15 agonizing years ago to a lie they orchestrated, I replied, my voice echoing coldly through the dark, abandoned warehouse. I have absolutely nothing left to lose in this world anymore. The next 48 hours were an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. I had to sit at the head of my polished dining table, break bread with my beautiful wife, and listen to my son casually discuss our upcoming initial public offering, all while knowing they were the architects of my living nightmare. Every bright smile Monica offered me across the silver serving platters felt like a jagged razor blade sliding slowly across my skin. Every confident, boastful remark Derek made about the highly lucrative future of our global logistics empire made my aging stomach violently churn. But I played my part completely flawlessly. I wore the pathetic mask of the tired, slightly confused, grieving patriarch, perfectly allowing them to firmly believe their emotional manipulation had completely succeeded. Meanwhile, Bradley Hughes and his elite team of former federal operatives were moving completely silently through the hidden shadows of my life. They had successfully infiltrated the heavily guarded mansion during the day while Monica was at her private country club. They had compromised the luxury vehicles, the encrypted smartphones, and the private master suites. I was practically holding my breath, nervously waiting for the devastating truth to finally surface. The call came on a secure, untraceable line late Tuesday evening. Bradley did not use names or specific details over the open airwaves. He simply gave me a designated time and the exact coordinates to a sterile, windowless room located deep inside a heavily secured downtown data center. I told Monica I had to suddenly review some critical last-minute legal documents for the corporate expansion, kissed her cold cheek, and walked out the heavy oak doors. When I arrived at the underground safe room, Bradley was already waiting. The sterile mechanical hum of the massive server cooling units filled the frigid air. A massive high-definition monitor completely dominated the back wall, displaying complex, incredibly dense financial flowcharts and overlapping maritime tracking routes. Bradley looked completely exhausted, his dark tie loosened and heavy dark circles framing his sharp eyes. He had been digging relentlessly, meticulously ripping apart the cloned hard drive I had given him at the shipyard. He quietly pointed a red laser remote at the large screen, instantly illuminating a complex, terrifying web of offshore banking transactions. "You were absolutely right to trust your terrible gut feeling," Richard Bradley said, his low voice deadly serious. "Your son is not just hiding an extortion plot. He is actively running a massive, highly sophisticated criminal syndicate right underneath your nose." I stared blindly at the rapidly flashing numbers on the screen. "Explain it to me," I demanded, my voice cold and entirely hollow. Bradley tapped a button, quickly bringing up the archived shipping logs of the older bulk cargo freighters I had investigated. The Iron Vanguard, the Ocean Drifter, the Seattle Star. "Derek did not just take over the route management 5 years ago," Bradley explained, pacing the small room. "He actively and intentionally repurposed your aging, less monitored vessels. He has been secretly leasing them out as ghost ships." I frowned, stepping much closer to the glowing screen. "Ghost ships?" Bradley nodded grimly, his face illuminated by the data. "He takes these specific ships completely off the official corporate registry during their long transatlantic voyages. He systematically cuts the primary satellite transponders and expertly fakes the detailed maintenance logs. During those undocumented stops in international waters, the exact ones perfectly matching the coordinates of the tragic maritime accident, these ships are transferring highly illicit, untraceable cargo to unknown mercenary vessels. But it gets infinitely worse," Bradley continued, heavily pulling up a series of highly redacted, heavily encrypted banking documents. "Derek is not just moving dangerous, illicit cargo across the ocean. He is washing the money." Bradley slowly traced a bright red digital line explicitly connecting the ghost ship transfers to a massive, heavily fortified shell company securely based in Eastern Europe. "Millions of dollars are flowing completely off the radar, Richard. Derek is systematically filtering massive sums of dark money from this incredibly dangerous Eastern European syndicate directly into the clean, legitimate revenue streams of Callahan Logistics. He is using your pristine, globally respected corporate infrastructure as a massive, invisible washing machine for an international criminal organization. The money enters through fake consulting fees, and inflated maritime fuel surcharges completely blending into your massive daily operating capital. I felt the sterile room begin to spin slightly as the sheer unimaginable scale of the betrayal violently crashed down upon me. My own flesh and blood was a high-level money launderer. He was deeply and willingly embedded with the exact same ruthless mercenaries who had likely taken his own older brother into the dark sea slave trade. But the final absolute most devastating blow had not yet been delivered. Bradley stopped pacing and looked directly at me with a profound, terrifying pity deeply rooted in his tired eyes. He clicked one final decisive button on his remote. A high-resolution digital copy of the master leasing agreements for the illegal ghost ships appeared brightly on the screen directly alongside the authorized signature cards for the secret offshore bank accounts receiving the illicit funds. "I want you to look very closely at the executive authorization signatures," Richard Bradley whispered softly. I stepped right up to the glowing monitor, my vision narrowing. My old heart stopped entirely. The blood in my veins ran completely cold. The signatures explicitly approving the illegal ship leases, the authorizations opening the Eastern European shell accounts, the executive orders bypassing the maritime transponders. Every single one of them bore my exact perfectly forged signature. "Everything is completely in your name," Richard Bradley stated, his heavy voice dripping with grim, terrifying certainty. "Derek has completely and totally insulated himself from the fallout. He deliberately structured the entire illegal operation explicitly through your specific executive credentials. He has spent 5 incredibly long years painstakingly building a massive, highly detailed paper trail that points entirely directly and undeniably straight at you. The brilliant, profoundly evil genius of their horrific plan finally locked into place with a deeply sickening clarity. This was exactly why they wanted me quickly declared mentally incompetent. This was exactly why they were pushing so aggressively and frantically for the initial public offering. If the federal authorities or the International Maritime Police ever discovered the hidden ghost ships and the massive Eastern European money laundering operation, Derek and Monica would effortlessly play the roles of the shocked, deeply innocent family members. They would eagerly present heavily fabricated medical records, boldly claiming I was hallucinating ghosts and suffering from severe, irreversible cognitive decline. I would be successfully painted as the deranged, corrupt billionaire who secretly built an illegal, highly dangerous empire in his twilight years. "If the federal agents ever find out about this massive conspiracy," Bradley warned quietly, "you will go straight to a maximum security federal prison for international money laundering. You will certainly die completely alone behind freezing cold iron bars. And while you are locked away, Derek will seamlessly step in as the innocent corporate savior. He will legally inherit the entirely clean empire, and he will happily walk away with absolutely everything you built." The heavy steel door of the underground safe room closed behind me with a resonating thud. Bradley Hughes had laid out the horrifying truth, and I had accepted it with cold clarity. I drove back to my estate, the fog mirroring the darkness inside my chest. Tonight, Monica and Derek were hosting a lavish dinner party. It was a carefully orchestrated event, designed to parade me in front of our corporate investors. They needed to publicly establish the narrative that I was a rapidly declining old man. I was expected to smile, vaguely nod at their condolences, and play the patriarch slipping into senility. I parked in the garage and walked up the staircase to prepare for my performance. By 8 in the evening, the formal dining room was ablaze with golden bright chandelier light. Classical music floated through the corridors, mingling with the chatter of Seattle's corporate elite. I sat silently at the head of the mahogany table. My posture was deliberately slumped. I kept my eyes unfocused, staring blankly at the floral arrangements. Whenever an investor offered a sympathetic platitude about my recent stress, I offered a weak, confused smile. Monica sat at the opposite end, dressed in an emerald gown. She played the fiercely supportive wife to perfection. She would occasionally look down the table at me, her eyes filled with a manufactured sorrow that captivated our wealthy guests. Meanwhile, Derek stood near the center of the room holding court with prominent board members. He was the picture of a brilliant young executive ready to shoulder the burdens of an aging father. He laughed smoothly at a terrible joke, raising his crystal glass to emphasize a point about our public offering. It was a breathtaking display of pure sociopathy. As I watched them spin their webs of deception, my mind focused entirely on the silent invasion taking place directly above our heads. Earlier that afternoon, I had bypassed the security mainframes guarding the estate. I had systematically deactivated the motion sensors and thermal cameras covering the east wing and the underground motorcade. Bradley and his team of elite operatives had slipped unnoticed into the mansion through the service corridors, while the catering staff was busy in the main kitchen. While Derek poured a $5,000 bottle of vintage red wine for a corrupt investment banker, I knew Bradley was standing in the dark shadows of my son's private garage. The operatives were moving with absolute terrifying precision. They were systematically dismantling the sleek dashboard of Derek's black Porsche. They wired military-grade audio transmitters directly into the electrical harness of the luxury vehicle. Every single phone call Derek made during his private commutes, every hushed conversation he had while speeding down the highway, would now be beamed directly to a secure server. While Monica gently patted the hand of a weeping corporate spouse weaving a tragic tale about my failing mental health, Bradley's second team was moving silently through the lavish master bedroom. They were planting highly advanced listening devices deep inside the ornate crown molding and behind the heavy silk window drapes. The room where my wife and youngest son had likely planned my total destruction was now completely compromised. While Samantha Derek's ruthless wife bragged loudly to a group of executives about her new charity initiative, another silent operative was carefully picking the heavy brass lock to her private lounging suite. They slipped miniature acoustic sensors behind the massive canvas paintings and inside the ventilation ducts. Samantha believed her private suite was an impenetrable fortress where she could safely scheme and manipulate. She had absolutely no idea that her pristine sanctuary had just been permanently breached. I sat at the head of the table, carefully cutting a small piece of roasted duck, chewing slowly, as the symphony of treachery played out around me. Derek walked over to my chair, placing a warm, seemingly affectionate hand firmly on my shoulder. He leaned down, his expensive cologne masking the scent of the rotting decay inside his soul. "Are you holding up okay, Dad?" he asked softly, his voice perfectly modulated to ensure the nearest investors could hear his touching concern. "You look incredibly tired tonight. We can excuse you early if the noise is getting to be too much." I looked slowly up at him, intentionally, allowing my hands to tremble slightly. "I am perfectly fine, Derek," I whispered, my voice intentionally weak and terribly raspy. "Just enjoying the wonderful company and the incredible wine. It is a beautiful evening." Derek offered a sad, patronizing smile, giving my shoulder one final squeeze before walking back to his captivated audience. I watched him go, my heart beating with a slow, icy thud. He thought he was brilliantly building a bulletproof narrative to steal my entire global empire. He honestly believed he was seamlessly orchestrating the tragic downfall of a legendary business titan. He had no idea that I was actively building a cold, inescapable iron cage right around him. Every smile I gave, every confused blink I offered, every frail word I spoke was a forged bar in that very cage. They thought they were incredibly smart. They thought they had accounted for every single variable in their massive, heavily layered conspiracy. But they had made one fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They had forgotten exactly who had built the brutal, unforgiving corporate empire they were trying to steal. They had forgotten the sheer ruthlessness required to rise from nothing and conquer a global industry. I was not a fragile old man waiting quietly to die. I was a sleeping apex predator, and they had foolishly decided to wake me up. The extravagant dinner party finally drew to a sophisticated close shortly before midnight. The wealthy guests slowly filtered out into the damp night, completely oblivious to the silent, invisible war currently raging inside the sprawling mansion. Monica kissed my cheek, acting perfectly exhausted by the emotional toll of playing my tragic caretaker. Derek and Samantha retreated gracefully to the East Wing, discussing their corporate victories. I walked very slowly, very deliberately back to my private study, locking the heavy mahogany door securely behind me. I walked directly to my desk and picked up my encrypted cellular phone. The screen was blank, devoid of any normal notifications. I stood silently in the dark room, staring out the large bulletproof windows at the freezing, thoroughly soaked grounds below. 2 agonizing minutes passed in total suffocating silence. Then the phone vibrated exactly once. It was a single heavily encrypted text message from an untraceable anonymous number. The message contained only 3 incredibly brief, profoundly terrifying words. "The network is live." A cold, deeply satisfied smile finally broke across my weary face. The invisible snare was now fully constructed, armed and perfectly hidden in the shadows of their own homes. The high-tech audio bugs were actively transmitting every whisper, every frantic phone call, and every sinister confession directly to Bradley's secure servers. I sat heavily in my large leather chair, placing the encrypted phone flat on the smooth mahogany surface. The time for blind suspicion was officially over. Now I simply had to wait for the filthy rats to start squeaking. The heavy grandfather clock in the main foyer chimed twice, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the silent, cavernous halls of the estate. It was exactly 2 in the morning. I sat perfectly still in the dark confines of my study, waiting for the final echoes of the chime to fade into absolute nothingness. The mansion was completely asleep, enveloped in a thick, artificial peace. I picked up the encrypted burner phone from my desk, slipped it securely into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket, and quietly exited the room. I moved through the dark corridors with the silent, practiced grace of a man who knew every single creaking floorboard and hidden shadow of his own home. I bypassed the main staircase and used the narrow, winding servant stairs that led directly down to the underground parking garage. The air was frigid, biting through the thin fabric of my clothing, but I barely felt the cold. A raging, white-hot inferno was burning deep inside my chest, fueling my every movement. I slipped out the heavy side door and stepped into the freezing, damp night air. The heavy fog from earlier had thickened considerably, rolling off the dark waters of the Puget Sound and blanketing the exclusive neighborhood in a dense, suffocating gray shroud. I walked quickly down the winding tree-lined driveway, keeping my head down and my footsteps entirely silent against the wet asphalt. About a block away, parked inconspicuously beneath the heavy branches of a massive ancient oak tree, sat a completely unmarked dull gray utility van. It looked exactly like a standard municipal maintenance vehicle, entirely invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. I approached the rear of the van and tapped my knuckles against the cold metal door in a quick, rhythmic pattern. The heavy locks immediately clicked, and the door slid open just enough for me to slip inside. The interior of the van was a highly advanced, cramped technological fortress. Banks of glowing monitors lined the reinforced steel walls, displaying live thermal imaging feeds, complex frequency spectrums, and scrolling lines of intercepted digital data. Bradley sat heavily in a rolling leather chair right in the center of the cramped space, wearing a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones resting around his thick neck. He turned to look at me as I securely locked the heavy metal door behind me. The glowing light from the monitors cast deep, harsh shadows across his weary face. "The estate network is completely stable," Bradley stated quietly, his deep voice barely rising above the mechanical hum of the advanced cooling units. "We have total audio penetration in the master suite, Derek and Samantha's private bedroom, and the East Wing lounge. The vehicles are fully wired and actively tracking. We are simply waiting for a localized acoustic trigger." I nodded slowly, pulling up a secondary metal folding chair and sitting down heavily beside him. The cramped space felt incredibly claustrophobic, reeking strongly of stale black coffee and raw, highly concentrated electricity. I stared blankly at the glowing green waveforms on the primary audio monitor, watching the tiny flat lines indicating absolute silence inside my own home. For a long, agonizing hour, absolutely nothing happened. The flat lines remained perfectly horizontal. My mind violently churned with horrific, suffocating thoughts, replaying the terrifying image of my beautiful wife, viciously destroying the blood-stained silver lighter in the kitchen disposal. Suddenly, at exactly 10 minutes past 3 in the morning, the primary audio feed actively monitoring Derek's private bedroom violently spiked. A sharp, jagged green line aggressively jumped across the dark screen, accompanied by the distinct, heavy sound of a solid wooden door aggressively opening and then immediately clicking shut. Bradley quickly leaned forward, his large hands rapidly adjusting the complex equalizer dials, expertly filtering out the ambient background noise to completely isolate the incoming vocal frequencies. I held my breath, my entire body tensing, with a rigid, painful anticipation. The audio feed crackled sharply with a burst of static, followed by the highly distinct, incredibly frantic sound of rapid footsteps heavily pacing back and forth across a hardwood floor. "You need to completely calm down right now," a harsh, incredibly sharp female voice hissed through the hidden microphone. It was Monica. My wife had quietly sneaked out of our master bedroom and actively infiltrated Derek's private sleeping quarters in the dead of night. Her voice was not the soft, comforting tone she used in public. It was deeply venomous, completely devoid of any maternal warmth, and radiating a cold, calculated fury. "How am I supposed to calm down?" Derek snapped back, his voice trembling violently with a raw, unadulterated panic. "He completely knows something is wrong, Monica. I saw the way he looked at me during the dinner party. He is aggressively testing us. He left the silver lighter sitting directly in the open wastebasket just to see what we would do." "I already handled the lighter." Monica sharply interrupted, her tone dripping with pure, aggressive contempt. "I completely destroyed the metal casing and entirely washed the ashes down the industrial disposal. There is absolutely no physical evidence left. He is just a paranoid, exhausted old man rapidly losing his fragile grip on reality. We just need to stay completely focused on the board vote next week. You do not understand the logistics of what is actually happening right now." Derek practically shouted, his voice cracking with sheer terror. Bradley aggressively tweaked the audio dial, making Derek's panicked breathing sound incredibly loud and distinct inside the cramped van. "The syndicate contacted me on the secure satellite line an hour ago. The entire operation is severely compromised. The maritime smugglers are panicking because the local authorities are sniffing around the private docks. We have paid the syndicate tens of millions of dollars to actively ensure this exact situation never happens." Monica fired back coldly. "They are highly trained professionals. They will permanently silence anyone who asks too many questions. They already eliminated the filthy dock worker who delivered the message." "That is exactly the problem, Monica," Derek hissed, his voice dropping into a dark, desperately horrified whisper. "The dock worker was never supposed to be anywhere near the cargo hold. The syndicate promised me they had absolute control over the lower decks." I sat frozen in the metal chair, the freezing air inside the surveillance van suddenly feeling incredibly dense and unbreathable. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. "Then how did your brother manage to make a transatlantic phone call to your father?" Monica demanded, her voice rising in a vicious, highly aggressive tone. "How did he physically get his hands on a cellular device after 15 years of absolute silence?" "Because that bastard bribed a dock worker for a phone," Derek hissed the reality of his words, causing his voice to break into a sick, terrified sob. "I explicitly told the syndicate to keep him chained in the lower hull. I paid them a massive fortune to ensure he never saw the sunlight again. He was supposed to rot in that cargo ship forever." The reality of the words hit me like a physical blow. My entire world stopped spinning. The sterile hum of the cooling units inside the surveillance van faded into absolute silence. Bradley did not move a single muscle, his hands hovering frozen over the audio equalizer board. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his seasoned eyes reflecting the same profound horror, violently tearing my soul apart. I could not breathe. My lungs felt as if they had been abruptly filled with heavy cement. My firstborn son, the brilliant young man I had mourned for 15 agonizing years, was not dead. He had been alive this entire time. He had been locked away in the dark, chained like an animal, in the filthy, deeply rusted lower hull of a cargo ship, and my youngest son had actively paid a ruthless syndicate to keep him there. The glowing green line on the audio monitor suddenly spiked again, brutally, dragging me back to the horrific reality of the live intercept. Monica let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed harshly through the tiny speakers. It was a deeply venomous, entirely evil sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand completely upright. "You are falling apart over a logistical error," Derek, Monica hissed, her voice dripping with a cold, terrifying arrogance. "You need to pull yourself together immediately. You are the chief operating officer of a global empire. Stop whining like a child." "A logistical error," Derek shouted back, his voice completely cracking under the immense weight of his raw panic. "Mother, my older brother just contacted our father. He bypassed the mercenaries, secured an untraceable cellular device, and made a direct, desperate plea for help. If the federal authorities trace that call, if they raid the shipping yards and find him chained down there, we are totally finished. We will spend the rest of our natural lives rotting inside a federal penitentiary." "Nobody is tracing anything," Monica snapped aggressively. "The Russian syndicate scrambled the digital signal exactly as we instructed them to do. Your father firmly believes it was a cheap extortion scam. We successfully neutralized his suspicions tonight. We just need to quietly contact the mercenary captain and have Tyler permanently relocated before the board meeting next week." I listened to the woman I slept next to for nearly 2 decades casually discuss relocating my kidnapped son as if he were defective machinery. The sheer sociopathy radiating from her words was profoundly paralyzing. But the horrifying revelations were far from over. "This was never supposed to happen, Sonaka," Derek groaned, his footsteps pacing erratically. 15 years ago, you promised me this would be perfectly clean. You swore the problem would be permanently solved." I sat rigidly in the folding chair as Monica let out a sigh of profound annoyance. "I did solve the problem, Derek," she stated, her voice dropping into a chilling tone. "You were struggling in the corporate shadows. Richard was grooming Tyler to inherit the logistical empire. He was going to give him the keys to the kingdom, and you were going to be left with table scraps. I was not going to watch my own flesh and blood be cast aside. I secured your future. I hired the absolute best maritime mercenaries money could buy. I paid them a massive fortune to rig that luxury yacht with incendiary explosives. A cold, nauseating wave of pure shock violently washed over my paralyzed body. My elegant wife had orchestrated the blazing inferno that consumed Tyler's yacht. She was a ruthless arsonist who burned a vessel to the waterline simply to clear the corporate succession path for her own biological son. You paid them to kill him, Derek fired back, his voice trembling with a cowardly rage. You paid them to eliminate him completely. But they did not do that. They got greedy. They were independent contractors, Monica replied coldly, showing absolutely no remorse. They saw an incredibly lucrative opportunity to double their profits, and they took it. They detonated the explosives successfully, faked the maritime accident, and pulled your brother out of the water before the rescue choppers ever arrived. They realized a strong, healthy young man was worth a fortune on the black market. So they sold him directly into the sea slave trade. The words echoed inside the cramped, freezing van, striking my chest with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The sea slave trade. It was an illegal, deeply horrific underground network of unregistered fishing trawlers and ghost ships operating entirely in unregulated international waters. Men were brutally captured, chained to rusted decks, and forced to work until they literally dropped dead. It was a fate infinitely worse than a quick, fiery death. He has been trapped in the dark for 15 years, Monica. Derek sobbed loudly, completely losing whatever remnants of his composure remained. 15 years. Do you have any idea what those mercenary captains do to the slaves down in the lower hulls? Do you know the horrific conditions they live in? They are kept in total darkness. They are beaten, starved, and chained directly to the iron bulkheads, and the syndicate uses our own cargo freighters to quietly transfer the illicit supplies, to keep those illegal fishing trawlers running. Every single time one of our ghost ships makes a drop in that sector of the Atlantic, I have to know he is down there suffering in the dark explicitly because of us. He is down there because it guarantees our survival. Monica interrupted viciously, her tone completely devoid of any human empathy. The syndicate keeps him alive as leverage. They hold him captive to ensure you continue quietly laundering their dark money through the corporate accounts. It is a mutually beneficial, highly lucrative business arrangement. You wash their offshore funds and they keep your brother permanently buried in the dark. It is the absolute cost of building our massive empire. You need to accept that reality and stop acting like a pathetic coward. I could not listen to another single word. The violently burning rage inside my chest erupted into a blinding inferno. I grabbed the edge of the metal desk bolted to the wall. I squeezed the thick steel, completely ignoring the sharp edges digging deeply into my flesh. I gripped the cold metal so hard that the fragile skin across my tight knuckles physically tore completely open. Warm blood slowly began to drip down my fingers, staining the white cuffs of my business shirt. But I felt no physical pain. The profound emotional devastation completely eclipsed everything else. My wife was not merely a calculating opportunist. She was a deeply evil, completely soulless monster who had orchestrated the horrific kidnapping and perpetual torture of my innocent son. And my youngest boy had actively funded his brother's captivity to protect his corporate status. I slowly released my bloody grip on the metal desk, turning my head to look directly at Bradley Hughes. The seasoned operative stared back at me silently, watching the dark blood drip from my torn knuckles. The time for gathering any quiet intelligence was over. We were no longer investigating a complex corporate crime. We were going to war against pure evil. The reality of the words hit me like a physical blow. I slumped forward in the metal folding chair, my chest heaving as if the oxygen had been violently sucked from the cramped surveillance van. Bradley remained perfectly still beside me, his hands hovering over the audio dials, his face cast in the pale green glow of the monitors. I could hear the harsh, ragged sound of my own breathing echoing in the small space. For a fleeting, desperate second, I tried to convince myself I had misunderstood the frantic exchange. I wanted to believe that Derek was simply a pawn, a terrified victim caught in a web of Monica's demonic design. I wanted to believe my youngest son was weak, perhaps cowardly, but not completely devoid of human morality. The audio feed crackled again, mercilessly shattering that final fragile illusion. "You are falling apart over a ghost, Derek," Monica hissed through the speakers, her voice dripping with an icy, calculated venom. "We contained the situation 15 years ago, and we will contain it now. You just need to hold your nerve until the public offering is finalized." "Do not talk to me about holding my nerve," Derek fired back, his voice rising in a sickening mixture of panic and deep-seated resentment. "You have no idea what it has been like for me. You set the fire, Monica. You paid those mercenaries to burn the yacht and clear my path to the top. But you left a loose end. You did not confirm the kill. For 10 years you let me believe he was dead. You let the whole world believe it. It was a necessary operational pivot," Monica stated, entirely unbothered by her own monstrous admission. "The mercenaries saw an opportunity to monetize him. They sold him to the sea slave trade. It achieved the exact same objective. He was removed from the corporate succession line, and you became the undisputed heir to the empire. It was a flawless execution of our long-term strategy. It was a ticking time bomb," Derek shouted, the raw desperation completely cracking his polished executive facade. "Do you remember when Dad promoted me to Chief Operating Officer 5 years ago? Do you remember when he handed me the master access keys to the global shipping routes? I found the anomalies within the first month. I tracked the route deviations. I cross-referenced the telemetry data. I thought our captains were smuggling narcotics. When I took a private helicopter to intercept the Iron Vanguard in international waters, I did not find drugs. I found the syndicate. And they introduced me to the man chained in the lower hull." I closed my eyes, a cold, heavy tear tracing a burning path down my weathered cheek. 5 years ago. My son had known the truth for 5 long, agonizing years. When he took over the logistics network, he had literally stood on the rusted deck of that cargo freighter. He had looked down into the dark, filthy hull of the ship. He had seen his own flesh and blood, his older half-brother chained like an animal in the freezing darkness. Tyler would have looked up at him. Tyler would have begged for his life, desperately crying out for his younger brother to save him from that waking hell. I gripped my knees, my knuckles turning bone white, as the horrific image burned itself permanently into my mind. "And what did you do with that ticking time bomb?" Derek Monica mocked, her voice utterly devoid of maternal affection. "Did you run crying to your father? Did you launch a dramatic maritime rescue mission to save your precious older brother? No. You did exactly what I raised you to do. You protected your own interests. You protected your inheritance. I made a strategic alliance to ensure our mutual survival," Derek snapped, trying to inject a pathetic sense of corporate authority into his trembling voice. "The syndicate recognized my administrative power. They offered me a mutually beneficial business arrangement. I used the corporate infrastructure to launder their illegal profits. I leased them our aging vessels to move their illicit cargo. I washed millions of dollars through Dad's pristine name. And in exchange, they guaranteed that Tyler would never see the light of day. They promised to keep him permanently buried in the dark, explicitly, so I could remain the sole heir to the Callahan empire. And it was a brilliant maneuver," Monica praised, her tone sickeningly smooth. "You secured your future. You insulated yourself by putting every single fraudulent document strictly in Richard's name. If the federal authorities ever breach the firewall, your senile, hallucinating father takes the entire fall. You emerge as the tragic, innocent son, forced to rebuild the broken company. You played the game perfectly, Derek. Do not lose your composure now just because a bribed dock worker slipped a cell phone into the cargo hold. The syndicate is unpredictable when they are panicked." Mother Derek whispered, his voice vibrating with sheer terror. "If they feel the authorities closing in on the Seattle docks, they will execute a full containment protocol. They will simply throw Tyler overboard with an iron chain wrapped around his chest. The loose end will be permanently severed." "Then let them sever it," Monica replied coldly. "It solves our primary problem entirely. Go back to sleep, Derek. We have a corporate empire to run tomorrow." The heavy click of a door closing signaled the end of the intercepted conversation. The green waveform on the monitor flatlined, returning the cramped surveillance van to a suffocating, deeply heavy silence. I slowly opened my eyes. The single tear that had fallen was the last one I would ever shed for the people living inside that mansion. The profound, overwhelming grief that had defined my existence for 15 years did not simply fade away. It fundamentally transformed. The unbearable, agonizing heartbreak of losing a child mutated, crystallizing instantly into a solid, impenetrable block of freezing ice deep within my chest. I stared at the blank audio monitor, feeling a strange, profound sense of absolute clarity wash over my entire being. I was no longer a grieving father. I was no longer a confused, aging patriarch, desperately trying to hold on to the shattered fragments of his broken family. The men and women sleeping comfortably in the lavish beds above me were not my kin. They were dangerous, calculating parasites who had systematically orchestrated the perpetual torture of an innocent man purely for their own financial gain. They had looked me right in the eye every single day for 5 years, smiling warmly, sharing family dinners and discussing corporate expansions, all while knowing my firstborn son was chained in a freezing, filthy ship hull. They had weaponized my love. They had weaponized my trust. They had weaponized my profound grief. I slowly turned my head to look at Bradley. The seasoned former federal agent was already looking at me, his face drawn tight with a grim, deeply understanding solemnity. He knew the man who walked into this van was gone. I was no longer a father to the monsters in that house. I was their executioner. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair. The heavy silence of the surveillance van pressed down on us like a physical weight. He reached for the encrypted radio on the metal desk. His professional instincts were instantly taking over. "I am calling the federal director right now, Richard," he stated. His voice was completely devoid of any emotion. "We have a live confession of international money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and human trafficking. The Bureau can scramble a maritime tactical unit within the hour. They can have helicopters over those shipping lanes before dawn to secure the cargo freighters." I reached out and grabbed his wrist. My bloody knuckles smeared bright red across the dark sleeve of his tactical jacket. My grip was like a vice born from a sudden, terrifying clarity. "No," I commanded. My voice dropped into a dangerous, lethal register. "You will not make that call, Bradley. You will not breathe a single word of this to any federal agency." Bradley stared at me. He was completely stunned by my reaction. "Richard, your son is currently being held hostage by a ruthless international crime syndicate," he argued. His tone was laced with a very profound urgency. "We need massive, overwhelming force to extract him safely. If we do not alert the authorities immediately, we are leaving him entirely at the mercy of seasoned killers." I shook my head slowly. My mind was calculating the terrifying logistics of a federal raid. If the authorities swoop down on those private docks with sirens blazing and searchlights tearing through the fog, the syndicate will immediately execute a full containment protocol, I explained. I forced my voice to remain completely steady. "These are not street thugs, Bradley. They are highly organized, brutal maritime mercenaries who operate entirely outside the law. The absolute second they spot a Coast Guard cutter or a federal helicopter, they will permanently destroy the evidence. They will wrap heavy iron chains around his ankles and throw him directly overboard into the black, freezing water. He will sink straight to the bottom of the ocean before the tactical teams ever breach the main deck. A raid will not save him. It will guarantee his immediate execution." Bradley slowly lowered the radio. The cold, harsh green light from the monitors reflected in his dark eyes as the grim reality of my words settled heavily over his entire demeanor. He knew I was absolutely right. The federal bureaucracy was a loud, clumsy instrument. We were currently dealing with a highly volatile, incredibly fragile hostage situation. "So what is the alternative?" he asked quietly. "We cannot just let him rot down there while Derek and Monica continue their masquerade." "We are going to buy him back," I stated with absolute terrifying conviction. "We are going to step directly into the criminal underworld and purchase his freedom with untraceable currency." I released his wrist and stood up in the cramped van. My physical pain was entirely erased by pure, sheer adrenaline. "I need you to contact your most trusted underground broker." I continued pacing the narrow floorboards. The kind of man who negotiates with ghosts and shadows. I need a direct, secure line to the mercenary captain running the lower hulls of the Seattle shipping yards. I want a meeting arranged by tomorrow night. Bradley exhaled a long, heavy breath. He rubbed his tired eyes carefully. "The syndicate does not negotiate with outsiders, Richard. They only deal in massive, untraceable sums of liquid capital. They will not take a wire transfer. They will certainly not ever accept a corporate bank check. They will demand completely clean, untraceable bearer bonds or raw diamonds. Then we will give them exactly what they want," I replied coldly. I turned away from the glowing monitors and opened the heavy steel door of the van. I stepped back out into the freezing, damp night. I left Bradley alone to make the necessary arrangements and walked swiftly back up the winding driveway toward my sprawling estate. I did not return to my private study. I bypassed the main floors entirely and took the secure biometric elevator straight down to the fortified sub-basement located beneath the massive mansion. The sub-basement was a highly restricted climate-controlled bunker that housed my emergency corporate vault. It was a massive, impenetrable steel room protected by state-of-the-art retinal scanners and a complex voice recognition lock. I stepped up to the heavy security panel. I stared directly into the red scanning laser. The machine hummed softly, verifying my identity, before the massive steel tumblers loudly clicked open with a heavy, satisfying thud. I stepped inside the freezing, sterile vault. The walls were lined with thousands of secure safety deposit boxes, containing the most sensitive, highly classified assets of Callahan Logistics. I ignored the stacks of proprietary blueprints and offshore deeds. I walked directly to a completely unmarked titanium safe bolted to the floor in the far corner. I manually spun the complex dial, entering a numerical sequence known only to me and my late father. The heavy door swung open, revealing very neat, perfectly stacked rows of high-denomination bearer bonds. These were entirely unregistered, completely untraceable financial instruments. They functioned exactly like physical cash. They moved silently through the global economy without leaving a single digital footprint. I had quietly amassed this specific emergency reserve over 3 long decades. I intended to use it only in the event of a catastrophic corporate collapse. I never imagined I would be using it to literally purchase my firstborn son from a maritime slave market. I pulled a very heavy black canvas duffel bag from the bottom shelf of the safe. My movements were incredibly precise, completely devoid of any hesitation or fear. I began stacking the thick bundles of bearer bonds into the dark bag. 1 million. 3 million. 5 million. I did not stop until the canvas bag was bulging with exactly $10 million in untraceable liquid absolute wealth. It was a true ransom fit for a king. It was a sum capable of toppling small governments or buying absolute silence from the most ruthless killers on the planet. I zipped the heavy bag closed and lifted it by the reinforced nylon straps. The physical weight of the $10 million felt incredibly grounding. It was the exact price of the life of my son. It was the ransom demanded by the monsters who had stolen 15 years of his existence. I walked back out of the secure vault, leaving the heavy steel door standing wide open behind me. I carried the heavy duffel bag back up to the main floor. I walked silently past the lavish, over-decorated rooms of my mansion. I passed the grand staircase leading up to the master suite where my demonic wife was currently sleeping. I passed the elegant, polished doors of the private wing of my youngest son, where he was likely dreaming of his stolen inheritance. My cold resolve did not break. I was going to buy my boy back from hell, personally. And when he was safely secured, I would burn this entire filthy empire completely to the bitter ground today. I stood up, the cold steel of the van floor solid beneath my feet. I instructed Bradley to immediately mobilize his heaviest tactical extraction unit. No federal involvement, no flashing lights, and no red tape to alert the syndicate. We were going to cut the head off this nightmare ourselves. Bradley nodded, his fingers flying across the encrypted communications terminal. Within 20 minutes, a team of 12 armed former operatives converged on a staging ground 2 miles from the waterfront. They wore unmarked tactical gear, carrying suppressed weapons and heavy breaching equipment. I arrived in a black vehicle, the canvas duffel bag filled with $10 million in untraceable bearer bonds resting on the passenger seat. I stepped out into the biting cold. Thick marine fog rolled heavily off the black water of Puget Sound, providing perfect natural cover for our operation. It was exactly 4 in the morning when we reached the rusted perimeter gates of Pier 4. The towering silhouette of the Iron Vanguard loomed ominously in the deep fog. The aging cargo freighter sat low in the freezing water, a dark, floating fortress of misery. Bradley signaled the team. They moved with terrifying efficiency, bypassing the sleepy dock security and scaling the heavy mooring lines. I followed behind the duffel bag slung over my shoulder. We breached the primary loading deck without making a single sound. The freezing air was thick with the foul stench of diesel fuel and rotting fish. Bradley pointed his suppressed rifle toward the captain's quarters high above the main deck. We moved silently up the steep iron stairs, stacking up against the heavy steel door. Bradley kicked it open with a brutal, deafening crash. The mercenary captain bolted upright from his bunk, frantically reaching for a heavy pistol resting on the nightstand. 2 operatives grabbed him instantly, slamming him violently against the metal bulkhead. He gasped for air, his eyes wide with sudden terror. I walked into the cramped, filthy cabin and dropped the canvas duffel bag directly onto the steel floor. I unzipped the nylon fabric, exposing the neat stacks of high-denomination bearer bonds. The captain stared at the fortune, his greed momentarily overriding his sheer panic. "You will take this $10 million and walk away from this vessel." I stated, my voice a deadly freezing whisper. "You will tell your syndicate bosses that a rival faction hijacked your cargo. If you fight us or ever breathe a word of this to Derek Callahan, my men will hunt you down and bury you in the deepest trench of the Atlantic Ocean. Do we have an absolute understanding?" The corrupt captain looked at the rifles pointed directly at his chest, then down at the massive fortune. He nodded frantically, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Take us down into the lower hull right now," Bradley commanded, pressing the hot barrel of his rifle hard against the base of the captain's skull. The terrified mercenary grabbed a ring of rusted iron keys and led us out of the cabin. We marched him forcefully down the narrow stairwells of the massive freighter. The deeper we went into the belly of the beast, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. The air grew incredibly hot and stagnant, devoid of any fresh oxygen. The heavy vibration of the massive diesel engines shook the rusted metal catwalks beneath our feet. We passed through a series of heavy watertight doors entering a section of the ship that did not exist on any official corporate blueprint. It was a forgotten, undocumented purgatory. The smell down here was absolutely horrific, a foul, nauseating mixture of raw sewage, stale sweat, and decaying flesh. My stomach violently turned, but I forced my legs to keep moving forward. We reached a final, massive iron bulkhead secured by 3 heavy steel padlocks. The captain fumbled nervously with the keys, his hands shaking violently under the intense pressure of our tactical team. The locks finally clicked open with a heavy, sickening thud. Bradley shoved the heavy iron door open, sweeping the pitch-black room with a high-powered tactical flashlight. The bright beam of pure white light cut violently through the darkness, illuminating a scene of absolute unimaginable horror. The lower hull was a sprawling, filthy dungeon. Dozens of emaciated, terrified men were chained directly to the rusted iron pipes lining the damp walls. They shrank away from the sudden light, raising their filthy, bruised arms to shield their eyes. I pushed past the tactical operatives, grabbing the heavy flashlight from Bradley's hand. I moved slowly down the long, rusted aisle, shining the bright beam across the faces of the broken, battered sea slaves. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs, echoing the heavy rhythm of the ship engines. I reached the very back corner of the miserable, freezing hull. The bright beam illuminated a solitary figure huddled tightly against a weeping iron pipe. He was 35 years old, but his severely emaciated frame made him look like a fragile, broken ghost. His skin was incredibly pale, stretched tightly over his protruding ribs and covered in thick, angry scars. His long, matted hair hung down in filthy tangles over his hollow face. Heavy, deeply rusted iron chains were wrapped tightly around his thin wrists and bound securely to the thick metal pipe. I stopped completely dead in my tracks. He slowly lifted his head, peering through the tangled curtain of dirty hair. Despite the horrific scars and 15 years of torment, I recognized him instantly. He had the exact same vibrant eyes as the boy I lost a lifetime ago. It was my son, Tyler. He stared into the blinding light, his chest heaving with slow, labored breaths. He did not recognize me at first. I was just another dark, anonymous shadow in his terrifying nightmare. I lowered the bright flashlight, stepping into his line of sight. I did not fall to my knees. I did not break down into dramatic weeping sobs. The profound anger inside my chest completely anchored my soul. I signaled to one of the tactical operatives. He stepped forward with a massive pair of heavy bolt cutters. The operative positioned the steel jaws over the rusted chains binding my son's wrists. With one powerful motion, the thick iron snapped. Tyler slumped forward, his atrophied muscles completely failing him. I dropped the flashlight and caught him firmly by the shoulders, pulling his frail body directly against my chest. He felt incredibly light, almost entirely hollow. I leaned down, pressing my face against his filthy, matted hair. I am taking you home, I whispered softly, my voice a solemn vow. And I am going to ruin them. Bradley moved in behind me, wrapping a thick thermal blanket tightly around Tyler's shivering shoulders. The team secured the perimeter, carefully lifting my fragile son off the freezing floor and carrying him swiftly back toward the main deck. We moved like ghosts through the thick morning fog, abandoning the massive freighter and leaving the corrupt captain standing alone with his bribe. My son was extracted and guarded in a private, highly secure medical facility before the sun ever breached the dark Seattle horizon. The brutal rescue mission was completely finished. Now the inescapable trap was closing tightly around the throats of the betrayers. I left the private medical facility just as the pale morning sun began to bleed through the thick layer of marine fog over the Seattle skyline. Tyler was resting comfortably, heavily sedated, surrounded by the best trauma specialists money could buy. For the first time in 15 incredibly agonizing years, my firstborn son was finally safe. I stood in the sterile hospital corridor for a long time, watching his chest rise and fall through the reinforced glass window. I placed my hand against the cold pane, making a silent, unbreakable vow to him. He had survived his waking nightmare. Now I was going directly home to ensure the architects of his suffering experienced theirs. Bradley handed me a thick leather briefcase as I stepped out into the freezing morning air. It contained every single piece of damning evidence his tactical team had meticulously gathered over the past 48 hours. I slid into the back of my armored vehicle and gave my driver the explicit order to return to the estate. The drive back to the mansion felt entirely surreal. The world outside my tinted windows was waking up to a normal, mundane Wednesday morning. People were walking their dogs, sipping hot coffee, and commuting to their ordinary jobs. They had absolutely no idea that I was carrying the heavy, undisputed power to completely obliterate 3 human lives. I stared down at the dark leather briefcase resting heavily on my lap. Inside were the heavily encrypted bank traces, the high-resolution photographs of the massive offshore accounts, the forged executive signatures, and the devastating audio recordings of the midnight intercept. I ran my thumb slowly over the smooth leather feeling, the immense crushing weight of the justice I was about to deliver. I arrived at the sprawling estate shortly after 9 in the morning. The massive wrought iron gates swung open smoothly, granting me access to the pristine, meticulously manicured grounds. I instructed my driver to park near the rear service entrance, quietly slipping out of the vehicle before anyone could announce my arrival. I walked through the quiet corridors of the grand house, my footsteps entirely silent against the thick, imported carpets. As I approached the main living room, the distinct, highly unmistakable sound of clinking crystal and bright, cheerful laughter drifted out into the hallway. I paused in the shadows, listening to the sickening sounds of their premature victory. Monica, Derek, and Samantha were gathered around the massive marble coffee table. The morning sun poured through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the bright golden light of the expensive champagne filling their delicate flutes. They were celebrating. Monica was wearing a pristine white silk robe, her face glowing with a dark, deeply sinister triumph. Derek stood near the grand fireplace, looking incredibly relaxed. His shoulders dropped, the heavy panic from the previous night entirely vanished. Samantha was laughing loudly at a joke Derek had just made, swirling her crystal glass with an elegant flick of her wrist. They honestly believed the massive cargo freighter had successfully left United States waters. They firmly believed the syndicate had permanently relocated Tyler, dragging my captive son deeper into the brutal darkness, far away from any federal jurisdiction. They thought they had brilliantly secured their stolen empire. I stepped completely out of the shadows and walked directly into the sunlit living room. I moved with a slow, terrifyingly calm precision. The cheerful laughter died instantly. 3 pairs of shocked, wide eyes snapped entirely toward me. Monica froze with her champagne flute halfway to her painted lips. Derek stiffened, his confident posture immediately evaporating into rigid tension. Samantha lowered her glass, her fake smile faltering, as she registered the dark, hollow look entirely consuming my face. "Good morning, Richard." Monica offered cautiously, her voice laced with a sudden sharp hesitation. You are up incredibly early. We thought you were still sleeping after the exhaustion of the dinner party. I did not answer her. I walked straight past them, my eyes fixed entirely on the heavy mahogany double doors serving as the main entrance to the grand living room. I reached out firmly, grasping the thick brass deadbolt, and slowly turned it until it locked with a heavy echoing click. I turned back around facing the three monsters who had completely destroyed my family. I walked directly over to the massive marble coffee table. I raised the thick leather briefcase and tossed it down with tremendous violent force. The heavy leather slapped hard against the polished marble, causing their crystal champagne flutes to rattle dangerously. What exactly is this about, Dad? Derek asked, his voice trembling slightly as he stared down at the dark briefcase. His eyes darted nervously toward the locked doors. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. The terrifying calmness in my tone was infinitely more lethal than any desperate shouting. It is about your profound corporate achievements, Derek, I stated coldly. It is about the incredibly lucrative, highly complex logistical network you have spent the last 5 years building behind my back. It is about the Eastern European shell companies, the dark money laundering, and the maritime ghost ships. The vibrant color completely drained from Derek's face in an absolute instant. His jaw physically dropped, his skin turning a sickly, translucent white. Samantha gasped sharply, taking a sudden, terrified step backward. Monica remained frozen, but I could clearly see the sheer, unadulterated panic violently exploding behind her dark eyes. I pressed a single button on my phone. The sophisticated high-fidelity house sound system wired seamlessly into every corner of the massive room instantly sparked to life. The crystal-clear audio from the midnight intercept violently filled the quiet living room. Monica's harsh, incredibly sharp voice echoed down from the ceiling speakers. I completely destroyed the metal casing and entirely washed the ashes down the industrial disposal. There is absolutely no physical evidence left. He is just a paranoid, exhausted old man rapidly losing his fragile grip on reality. Monica's eyes widened in sheer horror. She dropped her delicate crystal flute. The expensive glass shattered violently against the hardwood floor, sending a spray of expensive champagne and jagged shards across the pristine carpet. Derek began to shake uncontrollably. He backed away from the marble table, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The audio recording continued to play mercilessly, broadcasting their most demonic, deeply hidden secrets to the entire room. Then the speakers blasted Derek's own desperate, terrified confession from the previous night. Because that bastard bribed a dock worker for a phone. I explicitly told the syndicate to keep him chained in the lower hull. I paid them a massive fortune to ensure he never saw the sunlight again. He was supposed to rot in that cargo ship forever. The words hung in the freezing air, a heavy, suffocating blanket of absolute guilt. Derek reached frantically into his pocket, pulling out his expensive cellular device with violently shaking hands. He stared at the glowing screen, his thumb jabbing desperately at the glass surface. He was trying to call his corrupt security team. He was trying to call the syndicate mercenaries to warn them. But Bradley had anticipated his exact reaction. Bradley had parked the unmarked utility van at the end of the driveway and activated a military-grade signal jammer. The entire estate was enveloped in a massive digital blackout. There is absolutely no cellular service, Derek, I whispered, stepping slowly around the marble table. There is no internet connection. There is no landline. You cannot call your heavily armed mercenaries. You cannot call your highly paid offshore lawyers. You are completely and totally cut off from the rest of the world. Samantha began to sob hysterically, burying her face deeply in her hands, as the immense reality of their impending doom crashed down upon her. Monica backed slowly away from me, her back hitting the heavy locked mahogany doors. Richard, she pleaded, her voice a desperate, pathetic whimper. Richard, please, you have to listen to me. I did it to protect our family. I did it to protect our empire. You did it because you are a soulless, calculating parasite? I replied, my voice slicing through her pathetic lies like a frozen blade. And you failed completely. Tyler is not sitting in the dark hull of that rusting cargo freighter anymore. I physically pulled him out of that hell 4 hours ago. He is safe. He is resting. And he is going to testify against every single one of you. Derek collapsed completely to his knees, burying his face in the thick carpet. The sheer scale of the betrayal had broken my heart. Long ago, instantly freezing it into solid ice. I was no longer a father looking at his son. I was an executioner staring directly at a convicted rat. The trap had closed entirely, and there was absolutely no escape. I stood towering over them, watching their entire world shatter into dust. You tried to bury my son in the dark, I said, looking down at Derek's trembling frame. Now I am going to bury you. Make yourselves comfortable. The federal authorities will be arriving very soon. I reached into the briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of bank traces, and dropped them directly onto Derek's shaking hands. You have exactly 10 minutes to read your own death warrant. Use them wisely. I turned my back on the weeping traitors, staring out the massive windows at the bright morning sun, finally feeling the warm light on my face. The long, terrifying nightmare was entirely over. Justice had finally arrived. The agonizing 10 minutes ticked by with the slow rhythm of a death knell. I did not turn to look at the creatures cowering behind me. I simply stood by the massive windows, bathing in the clean morning sunlight, listening to the pathetic sounds of their unraveling. Derek was frantically flipping through the dense financial dossiers I had thrown on the table, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he realized every offshore account and every ghost ship lease had been thoroughly dismantled. Monica was paralyzed against the heavy mahogany doors, quietly weeping into her hands, stripped of her sinister elegance. Samantha was curled on the expensive carpet, rocking back and forth. They were trapped in the luxurious cage they had built with blood money. Suddenly, the quiet tranquility of the morning was violently shattered. The harsh, piercing wail of heavy sirens tore through the neighborhood, echoing loudly across the immaculate grounds of the estate. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the remaining morning fog, painting the high ceilings of the living room in chaotic colors. I watched as dozens of heavily armored black vehicles aggressively breached the main gates, tearing up the pristine driveway. Federal agents in tactical gear poured out of the transports, moving with swift militaristic precision. They immediately surrounded the perimeter of the massive house. Derek let out a horrific scream of pure despair, dropping the damning bank traces onto the floor. The sheer terror of accountability had finally arrived. The heavy mahogany doors behind Monica violently shuddered as the federal agents utilized a breaching ram. The thick wood splintered, and the doors burst wide open with a deafening crash, throwing my wife forward onto the marble floor. Over a dozen heavily armed agents flooded into the room, their tactical rifles raised, shouting sharp, immediate commands. They ordered Derek to the ground, securing his wrists behind his back with cold steel cuffs. They pulled a weeping, hysterical Monica to her feet, roughly twisting her arms. Samantha shrieked in absolute terror as an agent aggressively pinned her against the wall. The elegant living room was instantly transformed into a chaotic staging ground for federal justice. I turned away from the window, watching the meticulous execution of the law. A senior agent in a dark windbreaker walked directly toward me, giving a respectful nod. "The premises are fully secured, Mr. Callahan," the agent stated firmly. "The Maritime Task Force is simultaneously raiding the syndicate docks right now. We have them all." Before the federal agents could begin dragging the traitors out of the house, a steady set of footsteps echoed down the grand hallway. The heavy boots sounded completely out of place against the polished marble. The federal agents instinctively lowered their weapons, parting slightly to clear a path. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped slowly out from the shadows of the corridor and stood silently directly behind me. The bright morning sun caught his face, illuminating the deep, profound scars marking his pale skin. He was 35 years old, but his eyes carried the heavy weight of surviving a 15-year nightmare. He had been meticulously cleaned, his wild, matted hair neatly cut. He was dressed flawlessly, in a dark, perfectly tailored Callahan corporate suit, looking exactly like the rightful, undisputed heir to a global shipping empire. It was Tyler. Monica looked up from the floor, her tear-streaked face twisting into an expression of absolute horror. She stared at the ghost she had created, the young boy she had callously condemned to the dark sea slave trade. A raw, piercing scream tore from her throat, a sound so devoid of humanity, it chilled the blood of the hardened federal agents. Derek twisted his head to look at his older brother, his eyes wide with a sickening dread. He had known Tyler was alive. He had paid to keep him chained in the dark. Now the brother he had betrayed was standing tall in the sunlight, wearing the corporate armor Derek had tried so desperately to steal. Derek dropped his face back onto the carpet, weeping with loud, pathetic sobs. "Dad!" He choked out, his voice a miserable, desperate plea for mercy. "Dad, please, you have to stop them. Please do not let them do this to me." I was terrified. Monica manipulated me into the money laundering. I was just trying to protect the company. "Please, Dad. I am your flesh and blood. You cannot let them lock me away in the dark." I walked slowly across the room, stopping inches away from where Derek was kneeling in his expensive trousers. I looked down at him, my heart entirely encased in a solid, unbreakable block of absolute ice. I felt absolutely zero emotion for the pathetic creature crying at my feet. The final remnants of my paternal affection had been permanently incinerated. "I am not your father," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, hollow finality that silenced his weeping. "I only have one son, and he just came home. You are nothing but a filthy, opportunistic parasite, and I am finally exterminating you from my life. Take them out of my sight." The federal agents immediately dragged Derek and Monica toward the shattered front doors. Monica fought wildly, thrashing and screaming as the cold reality of spending the rest of her natural life in a maximum security federal penitentiary finally set in. Derek simply went limp, sobbing weakly, as they pulled him across the marble floor. I turned my attention to Samantha. She was standing against the wall, shaking violently. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading hope. She had always believed her hands were entirely clean.